The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the small apartment in Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood. It was the kind of November night that seeped into your bones, cold and unforgiving, much like the relationship Ariana Bellucci had endured for the past 3 years. She stood in the dimly lit living room, her hands trembling as she stuffed clothes into a worn duffel bag. Each item she grabbed felt heavier than the last, weighted not by fabric but by memories she desperately wanted to forget. The apartment that had once felt like home now resembled a prison, its walls closing in with every passing second. Ariana was 26 years old, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of opening her own bakery. Those dreams had dimmed considerably under the shadow of Marcus Chen, the man she had believed would protect her, cherish her, build a life with her. Instead, he had slowly dismantled everything she was. Marcus wasn't physically abusive in the traditional sense. He was far more calculated than that. His weapon of choice was words, sharp, cutting words that left invisible scars. He controlled her finances, monitored her phone, isolated her from friends and family. He convinced her that she was nothing without him, that her thoughts were invalid, her feelings were dramatic, her very existence was a burden he graciously chose to carry. Tonight something had shifted inside Ariana, shifted. Perhaps it was the way he had laughed when she burned the dinner, calling her useless in front of his friends. Perhaps it was the realization that she had stopped recognizing herself in the mirror. Or perhaps it was simply that she had nothing left to lose. She had made her decision 3 days ago, after a chance encounter that would change everything. But Marcus didn't know that yet. He didn't know that the frightened, compliant woman he thought he controlled had found something he never expected her to find: hope. The apartment door slammed open, and Marcus stormed in, his designer jacket soaked from the rain. He was a finance analyst at a mid-level firm, a man who wore expensive watches and drove a leased BMW to maintain an image of success that didn't quite match reality. His face was flushed, either from anger or the 3 whiskeys he had undoubtedly consumed at the bar with his colleagues. His eyes landed on the duffel bag, and his expression shifted from surprise to cold amusement. He didn't yell. That would have been too simple. Instead, he laughed, a low, mocking sound that filled the small space. Ariana felt her heart pounding, but she kept packing. She had to keep moving. If she stopped, if she engaged, she might lose her nerve. Marcus circled her like a predator assessing wounded prey. He picked up a framed photo of them from 2 years ago, before everything had truly fallen apart, and set it back down with exaggerated care. The silence between them was suffocating, punctuated only by the rain against the windows and the distant sound of traffic on the wet streets below. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. That was always the most dangerous tone. He told her she was making a mistake. He reminded her of how he had taken her in when she had nothing, how he had supported her, how no one else would ever tolerate her anxiety, her insecurities, her failures. He painted a picture of a world where she would be alone, struggling, crawling back to him within a week. Ariana's hands stilled on the zipper of her bag. For a moment, the familiar doubt crept in. What if he was right? What if she couldn't make it on her own? What if this was the best she deserved? But then she remembered 3 days ago. She remembered the cafe on Atlantic Avenue, the accidental collision that had spilled coffee across expensive Italian shoes, and the man who had looked at her not with anger but with something she hadn't seen in years, genuine concern. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and said the words that would set everything in motion. She told Marcus she was leaving. She told him she had found someone who treated her with respect. She told him she had found someone better. The apartment went silent except for the rain. Marcus stared at her for 3 long seconds, and then he erupted into laughter. Real, genuine laughter that echoed off the walls and made her skin crawl. He called her delusional. He said no one would want her, that whoever she thought she had found would abandon her the moment they realized what she was really like. He said she would be back begging, and when she came crawling back, he might not take her. Ariana grabbed her bag and walked toward the door. Her legs felt like lead, but she kept moving. Marcus blocked her path, still laughing, telling her to go ahead and run to this imaginary better man. He told her to see how quickly reality would crush her fantasies. She pushed past him and stepped into the hallway. The building was old, with peeling paint and flickering lights, but it had never looked more beautiful than it did in that moment. She was walking toward freedom, even if freedom terrified her. She descended the stairs, her bag bumping against her hip with each step. Marcus followed, still hurling words designed to break her, to make her turn around. She could hear neighbors behind their doors, probably listening to the drama but not intervening. That was how it worked in places like this. Everyone minded their own business. When she reached the front entrance of the building, she paused. The rain was coming down harder now, creating rivers along the sidewalk. She had nowhere to go. Her phone had only one contact she could trust, a number she had called just once 3 days ago, when she had finally worked up the courage. Marcus caught up to her at the entrance, his face now twisted with genuine anger. The facade of calm control had cracked. He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to hurt but enough to stop her, and he told her one final time that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Ariana pulled her arm free. She stepped out into the rain, letting it soak through her jacket and plaster her hair to her face. She walked 10 feet from the building entrance and stopped, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Marcus stood under the awning, watching her with that same mocking smile. He shouted over the rain, asking if she was going to call this mysterious better man. He told her to go ahead, to make the call, to prove she wasn't as pathetic as they both knew she was. Ariana's finger hovered over the contact. Her entire body was shaking, from cold, from fear, from the weight of 3 years of trauma. But she pressed the button. The call connected immediately. She didn't even have to say where she was. The voice on the other end simply said one word: stay. She lowered the phone and looked back at Marcus, who was now laughing again, telling her no one was coming, that this was her last chance to come back inside and apologize. And then they heard it. A low rumble in the distance, growing louder. The sound of engines, many engines, cutting through the rain and the night. Does Ariana's courage hold as the impossible begins to unfold? Stay with us to discover what happens when power meets protection in ways no one could have predicted. The first SUV appeared at the end of the block like a shadow emerging from the rain. It was black, sleek, and moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested absolute confidence. The headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating the wet pavement and the scattered trash bins that lined the residential street. Marcus had stopped laughing. His smile faded as he watched the vehicle approach and come to a silent stop 30 feet away. The engine idled with a low, powerful hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Ariana stood in the rain, her duffel bag hanging from her shoulder, her hair plastered to her face. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She simply watched. Then came the second SUV, and the third, and the fourth. They appeared from both directions, rolling down the narrow Brooklyn street in perfect formation. Each vehicle was identical, black, expensive, with tinted windows that revealed nothing of who sat inside. They parked in a line along the curb, one after another, with the precision of a military operation. Marcus took a step forward from under the awning, his face now registering confusion rather than amusement. Neighbors began appearing at windows, drawn by the unusual commotion. In a neighborhood where people minded their own business, this was impossible to ignore. The SUVs kept coming. 10 became 20. 20 became 50. They filled the entire block, and then they began filling the adjacent streets. The sound of engines created a symphony of power that drowned out even the rain. Each vehicle parked with exact spacing, their headlights creating a corridor of light that led directly to where Ariana stood. Marcus's confidence was visibly cracking. He looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He called out to Ariana, asking what kind of stunt this was, but his voice had lost its edge. Now there was something else in it. The first hint of fear. The SUVs continued to arrive. 100. 200. They came from every direction, coordinating with silent efficiency that spoke of money, organization, and power that operated on a level most people never witnessed. They blocked intersections. They lined every curb. The entire neighborhood was now surrounded by a fleet of identical black vehicles. People emerged from their apartments, standing in doorways and on stoops, watching the impossible scene unfold. Some pulled out phones to record. Others simply stared in disbelief. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed insignificant now compared to the show of force that had materialized in a matter of minutes. Ariana remained perfectly still. She knew what this meant. She had been told, but hearing about power and witnessing it were two entirely different things. 3 days ago, in that cafe on Atlantic Avenue, the man with the coffee-stained shoes had told her that if she ever needed help, truly needed help, she should call. He had given her his personal number. He had looked into her eyes and told her that no one would hurt her again if she didn't want them to. She had thought he was being kind, perhaps exaggerating. She had no idea who he really was. She only knew that his presence had made her feel safe for the first time in years, that his voice had been gentle when he asked if she was okay, that he had seen the bruises on her soul even though they weren't visible on her skin. The SUVs had now reached 500. The entire Red Hook neighborhood was locked down by this automotive army. Not a single horn honked. Not a single driver shouted. There was only the idling of engines in the rain and the collective held breath of everyone watching. Marcus had backed up against the building entrance, his expensive jacket soaked through, his carefully styled hair hanging limp around his face. He looked small suddenly, diminished, stripped of the authority he had wielded over Ariana for so long. He tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. The door of the lead SUV finally opened. The sound of that single door opening somehow cut through all the other noise, commanding attention. A man stepped out into the rain and the air itself seemed to change. Domenico Valenti was not what people expected when they thought of a Mafia boss. He didn't wear a tracksuit or gold chains. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, with a black overcoat that fell to his knees. His shoes were the same expensive Italian leather that Ariana had accidentally stained with coffee 3 days ago, though these were pristine. He was in his early 40s with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, a strong jawline, and eyes that held the weight of decisions most people would never have to make. He moved with the calm assurance of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be heard, who had never had to make threats because everyone already understood the consequences of crossing him. Domenico walked toward Ariana with measured steps, seemingly unbothered by the rain that soaked through his expensive clothing. His eyes never left her face. When he reached her, he stopped 3 feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. He didn't touch her. He didn't crowd her space. He simply looked at her with concern and asked without words if she was all right. Ariana nodded, unable to speak. Tears mixed with rain on her face, but for the first time in years they weren't tears of fear or despair. They were tears of relief, of disbelief, of the overwhelming realization that someone had actually come for her. Domenico's gaze shifted to Marcus, who stood frozen against the building. The look that passed between them lasted only seconds, but it contained volumes. It was a look that said, "I know exactly who you are and what you've done." It was a look that said, "Your time of causing harm is over." It was a look that said, "You are nothing." Marcus tried to speak. He tried to reclaim some semblance of control, to explain, to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. How do you argue with 500 vehicles? How do you maintain dominance when faced with power that could erase you with a single gesture? Domenico raised one hand, and the engines of all 500 SUVs went silent simultaneously. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the noise had been. The rain seemed louder. Every breath seemed amplified. The entire neighborhood stood in perfect, absolute silence. Domenico didn't speak to Marcus. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned back to Ariana and extended his hand, not demanding, but offering, asking permission, giving her the choice. Ariana looked at that extended hand, then at her duffel bag, then at Marcus, who stood defeated and small against the building that had been her prison. She took Domenico's hand. He led her to the passenger side of the lead SUV, opened the door for her, and waited while she climbed inside. The interior was warm and dry and smelled of leather and safety. Through the windshield, she could see Marcus still standing there watching, unable to process what had just happened to his carefully constructed world. Domenico walked around to the driver's side and got in. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a soft towel, which he handed to Ariana so she could dry her face and hair. The gesture was simple, thoughtful, and it broke something inside her that had been holding together by sheer will. She began to sob. Not delicate tears, but the kind of deep body-shaking sobs that come from years of suppressed pain, finally finding release. Domenico didn't try to stop her or comfort her with empty words. He simply sat beside her, a steady presence, and let her feel everything she needed to feel. When her breathing finally steadied, he asked if she had somewhere safe to go. She shook her head. He nodded, as if he had expected that answer, and told her he had made arrangements. She would stay in a secure location where Marcus would never find her, where she could begin to heal, where she could start rebuilding her life. Ariana looked out the window at the 500 vehicles that had appeared because she had made one phone call. She thought about the cafe 3 days ago, how she had been so embarrassed about spilling coffee, how this man had smiled and told her accidents happen, how he had noticed the fear in her eyes and had given her his card with 6 words written on the back, "Call me if you need help." She had thought he was just being kind. She had no idea she had accidentally collided with one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. She had no idea that Domenico Valenti's word was law in 3 states, that his organization controlled everything from legitimate businesses to the shadows where justice couldn't reach. She had no idea that his protection was absolute and irreversible. Domenico started the engine. At his signal, all 500 vehicles started simultaneously, creating a unified sound that echoed through the rain-soaked streets. They began to pull away in perfect formation, leaving Marcus standing alone under the awning, watching the impossible convoy disappear into the night. As they drove away, Ariana looked back one last time. Marcus was still standing there, diminished, powerless, stripped of the control he had wielded over her for so long. She knew he would never touch her again. She knew he would never even speak her name again, because she was under the protection of Domenico Valenti, and everyone in Brooklyn, everyone in New York, everyone who mattered, would know it by morning. The girl who was told she was nothing is now untouchable. But what does it mean to be protected by the most feared man in 3 states? Continue watching to discover the truth behind the silence that changed everything. The safe house was in Manhattan's Upper East Side, a neighborhood so different from Red Hook it might as well have been another planet. The building was pre-war luxury, the kind with a doorman who wore white gloves and an elevator operated by brass keys. Ariana's apartment was on the 8th floor, with windows overlooking a tree-lined street where people walked expensive dogs and carried shopping bags from stores she had only seen in magazines. The apartment itself was more spacious than anywhere she had ever lived. Hardwood floors gleamed under soft lighting. The furniture was elegant but comfortable, clearly chosen by someone who understood the difference between luxury and ostentation. There were fresh flowers on the dining table and a fully stocked kitchen with more food than she had seen in months. But the most important feature was something invisible: security. Domenico had explained during the drive that she would have protection 24 hours a day. Not obvious, not intrusive, but absolute. No one would get near her without his knowledge. Ariana stood in the living room that first night, wrapped in a borrowed robe after a long hot shower, and tried to process everything that had happened. Just hours ago she had been trapped in Marcus's apartment, believing she had nowhere to go. Now she was in a multi-million-dollar Manhattan residence under the protection of a man whose power she was only beginning to understand. She didn't see Domenico for the first 3 days. Instead, a woman named Sophia came each morning. Sophia was in her 50s, elegant and efficient, with kind eyes that suggested she had seen many women in Ariana's position. She brought groceries, helped Ariana set up a new phone with an untraceable number, and provided the practical support that made it possible to imagine a future beyond survival. Sophia never asked invasive questions. She never pressed Ariana to talk about Marcus or what she had endured. Instead, she focused on the present and the future, what Ariana needed right now, what her plans were, what dreams she had put on hold. When Ariana mentioned her old aspiration to open a bakery, Sophia's eyes lit up and she began asking detailed questions about recipes and business plans, as if failure wasn't even a possibility. On the 4th day, Domenico came to visit. It was early evening and Ariana had just finished making dinner, pasta with a simple tomato sauce, one of the few dishes she still enjoyed making after Marcus had criticized her cooking so relentlessly. She heard the knock and felt her heart rate spike. But when she opened the door and saw him standing there with his hands in his pockets and a gentle expression on his face, the fear dissipated. He asked if he could come in. She stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious about her casual clothes and the modest meal she had prepared. He removed his shoes at the door without being asked, a small gesture that somehow made him seem less intimidating. He accepted her offer of coffee and sat at the kitchen table while she poured 2 cups with shaking hands. They talked, or rather, Domenico asked questions and Ariana found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her. She told him about her childhood in a small town in New Jersey, about her Italian immigrant grandparents who had run a bakery and taught her to love the alchemy of flour and yeast. She told him about moving to New York with dreams of culinary school, about meeting Marcus when she was young and vulnerable, about how gradually she had lost herself. Domenico listened without interruption. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurance. When she finished, he shared something she hadn't expected: his own history. He told her about growing up in Brooklyn, about a father who ran a small restaurant and taught him the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He told her about the choices he had made, the path he had walked, the reality of the life he led. He was honest about who he was. He didn't glamorize it or apologize for it. He ran an organization that operated outside the law, because the law didn't always protect people who needed protecting. He made decisions that most people never had to face. He lived in a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was fatal. But within that world, he had his own code. Protect family, honor agreements, and never harm the innocent. Ariana asked the question that had been haunting her since that night in the rain. Why had he helped her? They had met once accidentally for maybe 10 minutes. Why had he given her his number? Why had he brought 500 vehicles to rescue someone he barely knew? Domenico was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his coffee cup, then at her, and said something that changed everything. He had seen his sister in her eyes. He explained that his younger sister, Juliana, had died 8 years ago. She had been trapped in a relationship much like Ariana's, with a man who isolated her and controlled her and convinced her she was worthless. Domenico had been too focused on his business, too confident that his sister could handle her own life. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. Juliana had taken her own life at 24 years old. Since then, Domenico had made a promise. If he ever saw that same fear, that same trapped desperation in someone's eyes, he would not fail again. When Ariana had collided with him in that cafe, apologizing profusely for the spilled coffee while flinching as if she expected to be punished for a simple accident, he had recognized immediately what she was living through. The conversation that followed was not romantic. It wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was something more fundamental, the beginning of trust. Domenico explained that he wasn't trying to control her or own her or trade one cage for another. She was free to leave whenever she wanted. The apartment was hers for as long as she needed it. His protection wasn't conditional on gratitude or obligation. He offered her something more valuable than safety. He offered her the space to heal and the resources to rebuild. If she wanted to go to culinary school, he would arrange it. If she wanted to open a bakery, he would provide the capital, as a business loan, not a gift, because he understood that self-worth came from earning, not receiving. If she simply wanted time to figure out who she was without Marcus's voice in her head, she could have that too. Ariana cried again, but these tears were different. They were the tears of someone realizing that kindness still existed, that not all power was corrupt, that she hadn't been forgotten by the universe. Over the following weeks, Ariana began to reclaim herself. She enrolled in a baking course at a culinary institute in Chelsea. She reconnected with her mother, from whom Marcus had systematically separated her. She started therapy with a counselor specializing in trauma and emotional abuse. She woke up each morning without dread for the first time in years. Domenico checked in periodically but never overstayed. His visits were brief, respectful, and always at times when she had indicated she was comfortable with company. He brought her a KitchenAid mixer in her favorite color, information he had somehow obtained from Sophia. He introduced her to a commercial real estate agent who specialized in restaurant properties. He treated her like a business partner, not a charity case. The protection remained invisible but absolute. Ariana never saw the security detail, but she knew they were there. Sophia mentioned casually that Marcus had left New York. Apparently he had accepted a job offer in Seattle and decided a fresh start would be beneficial. Ariana understood without being told that this opportunity had been strongly encouraged by people Marcus was too terrified to refuse. She also learned, through Sophia's carefully worded updates, that word had spread through certain circles about what had happened that night in Red Hook. The story of 500 SUVs appearing in the rain had become legend in the boroughs. People spoke about it in bars and restaurants, each retelling adding new details and speculation. But the core message was consistent. Ariana Bellucci was under Domenico Valenti's protection, and that protection was absolute. Other women began reaching out. Sophia would arrive with messages from friends of friends, women in situations similar to what Ariana had escaped, women who needed help but had nowhere to turn. Ariana found herself becoming an informal counselor, offering advice and encouragement, connecting women with resources, and occasionally, when situations were severe, passing information to Sophia, who would pass it to Domenico. She discovered that the 500 SUVs hadn't just been about her. They had been a message sent throughout New York and beyond. There was a line that shouldn't be crossed, and protecting the vulnerable was on the right side of that line. In a world where power was often used for destruction, Domenico had used it for salvation, and he had done so publicly enough that others would think twice before harming those under his protection. 6 months after that rainy night, Ariana signed a lease on a small commercial space in Brooklyn Heights. The location was perfect, close enough to Red Hook to feel like she was reclaiming territory Marcus had tainted, but in a neighborhood that felt entirely her own. The space would become Bella's, a bakery specializing in the Italian recipes her grandmother had taught her. Domenico attended the lease signing as her financial backer. The agreement was formal and proper, with interest rates and repayment terms that were fair but not charitable. He shook her hand across the table and told her he expected the business to succeed because he had seen her work and knew she was capable. As they left the real estate office, Ariana stopped on the sidewalk and turned to face him. She said something she had been wanting to say for months but hadn't found the right words. Thank you. Not just for the apartment or the money or the protection, but for seeing her when she had been invisible, for believing she was worth saving when she had stopped believing it herself. Domenico smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. He told her she had saved herself. He had simply moved some vehicles. They both knew that wasn't quite true, but it was the kindest lie either of them had ever been told. From victim to survivor to something more. Ariana's transformation is almost complete. But in a world where power and protection intertwine, what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Stay with us for the final chapter. The bakery's opening day was a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after that rainy November night when 500 SUVs had changed Ariana's life. The windows of Bella's displayed golden loaves of fresh baked bread, delicate pastries dusted with powdered sugar, and traditional Italian biscotti that looked exactly like her grandmother's recipe. The neighborhood had embraced the bakery before it even opened. Word spread about the woman behind the business, the quiet, determined baker who had overcome something difficult and had emerged stronger. People didn't know the details, didn't know about Marcus, or Domenico, or the convoy that had become legend in certain circles. They just knew that Bella's represented something good taking root in their community. Ariana stood behind the counter in the pre-dawn darkness making final preparations. She wore a simple white apron over jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, flour dusting her hands and forearms. She looked nothing like the frightened woman who had stood in the rain 12 months ago. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. Sophia arrived at 5 a.m. to help with the opening rush. Over the past year, their relationship had evolved from caretaker and client to something closer to friendship. Sophia's efficiency in the kitchen matched Ariana's, and they worked in comfortable silence, preparing for the doors to open at 6. Domenico had sent flowers, a tasteful arrangement of white roses with a card that simply read, "Congratulations on your beginning." He wouldn't attend the opening himself. He had explained months ago that his presence could be complicated, could draw attention she didn't need, could taint her fresh start with associations to his world. She understood and appreciated the distance he maintained, even as she felt grateful for the foundation he had provided. The bakery opened to a line of customers that stretched around the block. Local residents, business owners, people who had heard about the new Italian bakery and wanted to support a neighborhood business. Ariana served each customer with genuine warmth, recommering items, sharing the stories behind certain recipes, building the kind of community connection that her grandmother had always said was the soul of a good bakery. By noon, half the inventory was sold. By 2 p.m., the shelves were nearly empty. Ariana stood behind the counter, exhausted and exhilarated, experiencing the kind of satisfaction that comes from work you love doing well. She was mentally planning tomorrow's bake when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up with a welcoming smile that froze on her face. Marcus stood in the doorway. He looked different, thinner, older, worn down by something that showed in the lines around his eyes and the slight stoop of his shoulders. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple jacket and jeans. He didn't look angry or threatening. He looked defeated. The bakery went quiet. The 3 customers at tables sensed the shift in atmosphere, the sudden tension that crackled through the air. Sophia stepped forward from the kitchen, her body language protective, her hand moving subtly toward her phone. Marcus raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. He spoke quietly, his voice lacking the mocking confidence it once held. He said he didn't want trouble. He just wanted to talk to Ariana. 5 minutes, that was all he was asking. Ariana's first instinct was fear, the kind of bone-deep fear that had ruled her life for years. Her hands trembled. Her breath shortened. The walls of the bakery seemed to close in, transforming from her safe space into a trap. But then something else emerged beneath the fear. Anger. Pure, righteous anger at this man who had taken so much from her, who had made her question her worth, who had the audacity to walk into her bakery, her space, built with her effort and her dreams, and demand 5 minutes of her time as if he had any right to it. She told him to leave. Her voice was steady, clear, backed by a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She told him he had no place here, no claim on her time or attention. She told him that whatever he had come to say, she didn't need to hear it. Marcus's face crumbled. He said he had come to apologize. He had spent the past year in therapy, confronting who he had been and what he had done. He had lost his job, his apartment, his friends. Everything had fallen apart after that night. He claimed he understood now that he had been abusive, that he had damaged her, that he had been wrong. He wanted forgiveness, or understanding, or perhaps just absolution for the guilt that clearly haunted him. Ariana listened to his words and felt nothing. Not sympathy, not satisfaction, not even the anger that had flared moments ago. She simply felt nothing where he was concerned. He had become irrelevant to her life, a chapter that was closed, a shadow that no longer frightened her because she had learned to carry her own light. She told him she didn't forgive him, not because she was holding a grudge, but because his redemption wasn't her responsibility. His growth or lack thereof wasn't her concern. She had spent a year rebuilding herself, and she had no obligation to participate in his journey. She told him to leave and never come back. If he showed up again, she would call the police. If he tried to contact her in any way, there would be consequences. She didn't mention Domenico or the protection that still surrounded her. She didn't need to invoke anyone else's power. Her own was sufficient. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that there would be no dramatic reconciliation, no movie moment where the victim provides closure for the abuser's character arc. He turned to leave, and as he reached the door, he looked back one last time. He said he was glad she was doing well, that she deserved to be happy. Ariana didn't respond. She simply watched him walk out of her bakery and out of her life. The door closed. The bell chimed. The customers gradually resumed their conversations. Sophia appeared at Ariana's side, asking if she was all right. Ariana realized she was. She was more than all right. She had faced the source of her trauma and discovered it no longer had power over her. That evening, after closing the bakery, Ariana walked through Brooklyn Heights as the sun set over the city. The October air was cool, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. She thought about the past year, about everything she had lost and gained, about the person she had been and the person she was becoming. She thought about Domenico and the complicated gift he had given her. His protection had been absolute, but he had been careful never to let it become another cage. He had given her resources, but required her to earn her independence. He had shown her that power could be used for good, even when it operated outside traditional structures of justice. She understood now what the 500 SUVs had really meant. It wasn't about intimidation or flexing authority. It was a message to everyone watching. This woman matters. Her safety matters. Her future matters. And anyone who threatened those things would face consequences. But more importantly, it was a message to Ariana herself. You are worth protecting. You are worth 500 vehicles appearing in the rain. You are worth the effort, the resources, the commitment. You matter. That message had taken root inside her and grown into something sustainable. She no longer needed 500 SUVs because she had learned to protect herself. She had learned her own worth and built a life that reflected it. The bakery, the independence, the boundaries she now enforced. These were her own armor, forged through the space Domenico had given her to heal and grow. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Domenico, the first direct contact they had had in months. The message was simple. Heard about the visitor, you handled it well, proud of you. She smiled, appreciating that somehow he knew about Marcus's appearance. The invisible protection was still there, still watching, still ensuring she was safe even as she built her independent life. But it was background now, not the foundation. She was standing on her own. She texted back, "Thank you for everything." His response came quickly. "You did the work. I just moved some vehicles." It was their private joke now, That phrase that acknowledged his role while respecting her agency. She had saved herself, rebuilt herself, created a life worth living. He had simply provided the umbrella during the storm. Ariana arrived back at her apartment, no longer the Upper East Side safe house but a modest place in Brooklyn Heights close to her bakery, paid for with her own earnings. It was small, but it tentar novamente. T Continua was hers, truly hers, and that made it more valuable than any luxury penthouse could ever be. She made herself dinner, something simple and comforting, and ate while watching the city lights flicker on across the borough. She thought about tomorrow's bake, about the new recipes she wanted to try, about potentially hiring her first employee as business continued to grow. She thought about ordinary things, beautiful in their mundanity, precious because they were hers to think about. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Ariana caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She studied her face, really looked at it for the first time in months. The woman staring back at her had changed. There were laugh lines around her eyes from genuine smiles. Her shoulders no longer carried the permanent tension of someone waiting for criticism. Her eyes held something they hadn't held in years: peace. She thought about the girl who had stood in the rain 12 months ago, terrified and broken, making one desperate phone call because she had nothing left to lose. That girl had been brave, braver than she had known, taking that first step toward freedom even when she couldn't see where it would lead. And she thought about Marcus's visit today, how she had expected to feel triumphant or vindictive when he finally faced consequences, but instead had felt nothing at all. That nothingness was its own kind of victory. He no longer occupied space in her emotional landscape. He was simply a person who had once harmed her, who she had survived, who no longer mattered. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Ariana's life that felt almost magical in its normalcy. She woke before dawn to bake. She served customers who became regulars, learning their names and preferences. She experimented with new recipes, sometimes succeeding spectacularly and sometimes creating disasters that made Sophia laugh. She attended a book club with neighbors. She went on a few casual dates, nothing serious, just remembering what it felt like to be treated with basic respect and kindness. She also continued helping other women, the ones who reached out through Sophia's network. She met them in the bakery after hours, sharing coffee and pastries while listening to stories that echoed her own. She didn't have all the answers, but she had experience and resources and the knowledge that escape was possible. Some women took her advice, some weren't ready. She learned not to take it personally, to plant seeds and trust that they would grow when the time was right. One evening, 3 months after the bakery opening, Domenico asked if she would meet him for dinner. It was the first social invitation he had extended, the first time their interaction would be something other than business or welfare checks. Ariana accepted, curious about what this meant. The restaurant was quiet and elegant, the kind of place where privacy was guaranteed, and the waitstaff moved with silent efficiency. Domenico was already seated when she arrived, and he stood as she approached, a gesture of respect that Marcus had never bothered with. They talked over excellent food and better wine. The conversation ranged from her bakery's success to his legitimate business ventures to their shared love of old movies. It was easy and comfortable, two people who had shared an unusual journey discovering they actually enjoyed each other's company, beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Near the end of the meal, Domenico became serious. He told her something she hadn't known. The night of the 500 SUVs had become a turning point in his organization. It had sent ripples through the networks he operated in, signaling a shift in priorities. Protection of the vulnerable had become an explicit part of their code. Other organizations had taken note. Women in dangerous situations were finding their way to resources that hadn't existed before. He told her this not to take credit, but to show her that her courage had created something larger than herself. By being willing to make that phone call, by being willing to accept help, by being willing to rebuild publicly rather than hiding in shame, she had inadvertently started a movement. Other women were finding the courage to leave because they had heard her story and knew that protection was possible. Ariana sat with this information, understanding that her personal trauma had somehow transformed into collective healing. It was overwhelming and humbling and terrifying and beautiful all at once. Domenico reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he had initiated physical contact beyond that initial handhold in the rain. He told her that helping her had changed him too. It had reminded him why he had chosen this life, why he had built power in the first place. Not for wealth or status, but to protect people who the system failed to protect. She had given him back his purpose. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people whose lives had collided accidentally and had irrevocably changed each other. There was no romance in the moment, no dramatic declaration. There was simply recognition. They had both saved each other in different ways. As Domenico drove her home that night, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets, it had started to rain again. A gentle autumn rain rather than the violent November downpour of a year ago. Ariana realized something profound. She had thought the story was about being rescued. She had thought it was about 500 SUVs appearing like knights in shining armor. But the real story was about what happened after. It was about the slow, difficult, unglamorous work of healing. It was about learning to trust herself again, to believe she was worthy of good things, to build a life that reflected her values rather than someone else's control. The SUVs had been dramatic and necessary, but they were just the beginning, not the ending. The ending, or rather the new beginning, was a small bakery in Brooklyn Heights where a woman who had once been told she was worthless was now creating something beautiful every day. It was the network of women helping women, protection extending beyond one dramatic night into sustained support systems. It was the quiet revolution of people using their power not to dominate, but to liberate. A year and a half after that rainy November night, Ariana received an unexpected visitor at the bakery. It was a young woman, maybe 23, with nervous eyes and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She approached the counter hesitantly and asked if she could speak to Ariana privately. They sat in the back office, and the young woman, her name was Emma, told a story that Ariana knew by heart because she had lived it herself. An abusive boyfriend, escalating control, the feeling of being trapped with nowhere to turn. And then, a friend who knew someone who said that Ariana Bellucci might be able to help. Ariana listened, and when Emma finished, she picked up her phone and made a call. Not to Domenico, she rarely needed to contact him directly anymore, but to Sophia, who coordinated the network that had grown from that first desperate phone call. Within an hour, Emma had a safe place to stay, a security detail she would never see, and a path forward. As Emma left the bakery, her eyes holding the first glimmer of hope Ariana had seen when she walked in, Ariana understood that this was the true legacy of 500 SUVs. Not the display of power, but what that power enabled. A network of protection, a community of survivors, a system that caught women when they fell and helped them learn to fly. That evening, Ariana stood in her bakery after closing, looking at the empty display cases that would be filled again tomorrow with bread and pastries and all the small acts of creation that made up a meaningful life. She thought about how far she had come from that broken woman in the rain. She thought about Marcus somewhere in Seattle, and felt nothing. He was irrelevant to her story now, a prologue that no longer defined the narrative. She thought about Domenico, and felt gratitude mixed with understanding. He had given her a gift, but not the one people assumed. He hadn't saved her. He had simply held space long enough for her to save herself. And she thought about all the Emmas out there, the women still trapped in their own rainy nights waiting for the courage to make a phone call, to take a first step, to believe that something better existed beyond the walls of their prisons. The rain started again outside, tapping gently against the bakery windows. But Ariana wasn't afraid of rain anymore. Rain was just weather, passing and temporary, leaving everything cleaner when it was done. She locked up the bakery, walked home through the gentle October rain, and slept the dreamless sleep of someone who had fought her monsters and won. Not through violence or revenge, but through the simple, revolutionary act of building a life worth living. The 500 SUVs had rolled away into legend, the story told and retold in bars and restaurants across Brooklyn. But the real miracle wasn't the vehicles. It was the woman who had stepped out of the rain and into her own power, who had learned that protection was a bridge, not a destination, and who now stood as living proof that healing was possible, that escape was achievable, that the voice in your head saying you were worthless was a liar. Ariana Bellucci had been told she would come crawling back. Instead, she had learned to fly. And in helping others learn to fly as well, she had discovered the most powerful truth of all. The opposite of being controlled wasn't just being free. It was having the power to help others become free too. That was the real story. Not the SUVs, but what came after. Not the rescue, but the rebuilding. Not the moment of dramatic intervention, but the thousand small moments of choosing to believe in your own worth, to trust in your own strength, to build a life that no one could take away. Because in the end, the most powerful protection wasn't 500 vehicles or an organization feared across 3 states. It was believing, truly, deeply believing, that you deserved better, and having the courage to claim it. Ariana had learned that lesson, and now, one woman at a time, she was teaching it to others. The rain continued to fall on Brooklyn, washing the streets clean, preparing the world for tomorrow's new beginning. The second location of Bella's opened in Manhattan's West Village on a sunny spring morning. Ariana stood outside, watching workers install the sign, her grandmother's recipe book tucked under her arm, the same book she had rescued from Marcus's apartment that rainy night. The only thing besides her clothes she had taken with her. Sophia stood beside her, now officially her business partner. The network they had inadvertently created had formalized into a non-profit organization, funded quietly by Domenico and others who understood that power carried responsibility. They helped women escape abuse, providing safe housing, legal assistance, job training, and most importantly, the message that they deserved better. Emma, the young woman who had walked into the bakery 2 years ago, now managed the Brooklyn Heights location. She had taken to baking like she had been born to it, and her honey almond cookies had become the bakery's best seller. Ariana's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the expansion. Your grandmother would be proud." She smiled, recognizing Domenico's style even from a new number. He changed phones regularly, a habit from his world that she had learned not to question. They saw each other occasionally, still friends, still connected by that rainy November night that had changed both their lives. But they had never become romantic. She had needed to discover who she was without being defined by a relationship, and he had understood that. Their bond was deeper than romance anyway, forged in crisis, maintained through mutual respect, strengthened by shared purpose. A young woman approached the bakery entrance looking lost and afraid, clutching a piece of paper with the address. Ariana recognized that look immediately. She had worn it herself once. She walked over and introduced herself, offering what she had been given: hope, protection, and the promise that the story didn't have to end in darkness. The young woman began to cry, and Ariana simply stood beside her, a steady presence remembering how Sophia had done the same for her. The cycle continued. Broken people helping broken people heal, creating something beautiful from the shattered pieces. The sign above the bakery caught the morning light. Bella's, fresh starts daily. It was more than a clever bakery slogan. It was a promise. It was a philosophy. It was a revolution disguised as pastries and bread. Ariana Bellucci had once been told she was nothing. She had been told no one would protect her the way her abuser did. She had been told she would come crawling back. Instead, she had built an empire of second chances, one woman at a time. The 500 SUVs had long since rolled away, but their echo remained, not in fear or intimidation, but in the lives they had helped transform, the network they had enabled, the message they had sent. You matter, you're worth protecting, and you deserve better. That rainy November night had been the beginning, but this sunny spring morning with a second bakery opening and another woman finding hope, this was the triumph. Not the rescue, the rebuilding, not the moment of intervention, the lifetime of becoming, not the SUVs, the strength to no longer need them. Thank you for staying with us through Ariana's journey from victim to survivor to victor. Her story reminds us that true power isn't just about protection, it's about what we do with the second chances we're given, and how we extend those chances to others. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about resilience, transformation, and the extraordinary strength of ordinary people. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that escape is possible, that healing is real, and that their worth isn't defined by those who tried to diminish them. Drop a comment below telling us what part of Ariana's journey resonated most with you. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is accept it. And sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is heal loudly, so others know healing is possible. Your story doesn't end where your trauma began. Like Ariana, you can build something beautiful from the broken pieces. Until next time, remember, you are worth 500 SUVs. You are worth the effort. You matter. Subscribe, share, and we'll see you in the next story.